Hey, all right, guys. Decided to get out of that studio called my living room. Mr. Asaf's condo that I rent. Landlord Asaf, good guy. Hey, but I got out here, just down the road from you guys here. Get outside, get some sun, get some walking around. But we got the big quiz to get ready for, so this is a little review. So I'm going to touch on some questions, some of the questions that you guys have sent me, some of the stuff that has been difficult for people to for some of the students in the past, some of the things that have tripped them up. So I kind of made some notes here and I'm going to go through them. Hey, first thing is this. There are a few of the numbers that I want you to know. Hopefully some of you guys did for fun, just to get kind of an idea of the magnitude of some of these numbers that we're dealing with. We're talking about the measurements of GDP, and we're coming up with these little examples with, apples and oranges, or poi and lays, or whatever we got there. But we want to get an idea of what it is in real life, because in real life it's all the goods and services that we're getting in there. And so hopefully you guys looked that up using the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA.gov, Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov, and finding those statistics. Now, what are the ones that you need to know for the big quiz that I expect you to know? The ones that I expect you to know are the 2009 nominal GDP. So I know we got the quarterly data so far for 2010, but I want you to have the end of the year 2009 nominal GDP. You need to know what that is. Okay, anybody? It's 14.12 trillion dollars. Okay, so we just want to get an idea of what that is, but that's a number you'll have to know. $14.1 trillion. Okay, another number I want you to know, and this is really so that you understand the magnitude of the different categories within GDP, and that is consumption, which is by far the biggest of the spending categories in GDP, and that's 10 trillion. It rounds pretty easily there, but $10 trillion. So you see, out of the 14.12 trillion, 10 trillion of that is consumption spending. Okay, now those are I want that 14.12 is the most important number, but I want you to know that 10 trillion just so you see the relative magnitude. Okay, some other ones that you might pay some attention to, maybe show up, maybe not, maybe somewhat of a bonus, is the other categories. Investment spending for 2009, $1.59 trillion. Okay, so much smaller than consumption spending. That one also tends to vary a lot more with the economy. We see investment spending. This recession has been very hard recession because consumption spending has been so limited. A lot of times what we'll see is that in a recession we still see consumption spending not vary as much. Usually the volatility is in the investment spending and what businesses do. And so that's why right now it's tough because not only are businesses not spending on investment, but also households are adjusting their consumption behavior. Okay, so what was that again? Investment, 1.59 trillion. Okay, what's the government spending? And this one's in the media a lot. In fact, most of the time they're talking about the deficit. But remember, this is not the federal government spending. Remember, government, it's all the levels of spending for government. That's federal, state, local. And so this is a total of those. $2.9 trillion. 2.9 trillion. So we're right about $3 trillion. Okay. Remember though, that's not just federal. That's federal, state, local. That's from military to fixing the potholes in the road, all of the government expenditure. And of course, if you add those up, that comes up to be a number that is greater than $14.12 trillion. Because what's the other category? Net exports. And that number is greater than the 14.12 trillion because we have to subtract off. Why? Because our net exports are negative. Now, really, when you look at it in the big picture, we talk about how important a global economy is. And for some countries, this net exports is a huge component of their GDP. For the United States, so much of what happens in our country is what we consume is produced in our country. As much as the media talks about how much we import, think about this. Imports in the U.S. were, I didn't write down that number actually, sorry, imports and exports, but those are less than 2 trillion. Both our imports and our exports, less than 2 trillion. And when we look at the net balance, the net exports, it's negative 386.4 billion. Okay, so when we look at that as a ratio of their entire GDP, it is pretty small. I mean, the United States is big, and a lot of the trade that we do is within our country. We buy stuff that's produced in our country. Remember, the two biggest trading partners of the U.S. are Canada and Mexico. We tend to trade with our neighbors, and that's true. That's a pattern that we see worldwide, is because of transportation costs. Some of the best deals are when we trade with our neighbors, according to our comparative advantage. Okay, so those are important numbers for you to know. $14.12 trillion. Consumption, $10 trillion. Okay, another important number for you to get is the unemployment rate. Now, a lot of times I say, what's the current unemployment rate? Now, this is going to be a little bit tricky for you guys because we're taking that big quiz on Monday. What's the current unemployment rate? Guess what happens tomorrow? Or today, actually, you're probably watching this video. What came out this morning? So I don't know what the current unemployment rate is. I might ask that question, though, and I expect you to look that up and know that. So you might take a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics to find that one out. So that's the current one. But what's the one that we know right now? What's the most current until that report comes out tomorrow? That's for October 2010, and it was 9.6% unemployment. So I want you to know that so you can understand the magnitudes. It's kind of interesting. We'll talk later about the fluctuations in the economy and get more into this recession. But clearly, this unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment. You guys looked up the natural rate of unemployment and looked into that. Remember, I said let's give it a range because there are different estimates of the natural rate of unemployment. 4 to 6%, okay? Probably right around 5, and there's going to be some people that say on the higher side, closer to 6, and other people that say on the lower side. For a long time there, some people were really saying, hey, the natural rate is lower. It's down, 4.5, it's closer to 4. But it can vary. It can vary in that it varies, though it changes at glacial speeds, okay? And so we'll look into that more. But remember, what's the rate? The natural rate of unemployment is between 4 and 6%. What's our current rate of unemployment? 9.8%. Unemployment is higher than the natural rate because we're in a recessionary gap, meaning our GDP, our economy is operating below capacity. Okay? So those are the numbers for you to remember. Keep those in mind. Now, since I mentioned there the gap, that we're currently in a recessionary gap, you will have to draw some of those gaps. And so you had the worksheet, and we introduced the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. One of the things to remember there is that if we have an inflationary gap, GDP, the actual GDP, where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect, that is going to be, the actual GDP is going to be greater than the potential. That's an inflationary gap, which means unemployment would be less than the natural rate. Because we're producing so much, we've got to hire up more workers. And so that's going to put unemployment down below the natural rate. Remember, that's something that we can't really sustain over the long run. A lot of times people say, hey, that's great, GDP's up, that's great. But if GDP is above our capacity, we can't sustain that in the long run, only in the short run. Eventually, that's going to lead to more inflation, and the economy will move back to the potential. And that's why it was so important when we talked about economic growth, that we talked about our potential changing. Because if you really want your economy to grow, you've got to increase your potential, not just increase GDP or above potential, because you can't sustain that. All right?